Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2019 Pritzker Forum on Global Cities.
Cities are at the forefront of global transformations. They have the resources and capacity to change the world. But cities are also vulnerable. The world's most pressing challenges are concentrated in cities. Nation-states alone will not solve the problems. Mayors are stepping up, defining global agendas and breaking down barriers. Infrastructure, environment, inequality, mobility, governance, migration, jobs, security. Global cities are living urban laboratories, making big plans, developing bold solutions. The world of the past was defined by nations. The world of the future will be defined by cities. Join us in Chicago, June 5th through the 7th, for the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities.
Please welcome to the stage the President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Ivo Daalder.
Good evening. I'm Ivo Daalder, the President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2019 Pritzker Forum on Global Cities, which we host in partnership with the Financial Times. This is our 5th year of hosting this important conference. It's an exciting milestone for us to look back on where we've been, where we're headed, and why we're doing what we're doing. This year's theme is Big Plans, Bold Solutions. It's a nod to Daniel Burnham, the famous architect and urban designer who said, "Make no little plans, for they have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans." Among Burnham's most important and biggest plan was the Plan of Chicago, which he drafted in 1909, including ambitious proposals to help turn Chicago into the remarkable, beautiful, and gorgeous city it is today. And here we are 110 years later, envisioning our big plans for the cities of the future and our bold solutions for the immense global challenges that our world is facing. The Pritzker Forum on Global Cities has sought to be at the forefront of a new dialogue about cities as actors on the global stage. For urbanists among you here, the importance of cities is obvious. But for many other sectors in our society, the academy, the private sector, the foreign policy community, national and international institutions, the role of cities is not immediately apparent. And to what the extent it is, there is a debate about what that role should be. How much autonomy or influence should cities have? Can actions taken locally be scaled nationally or even globally? What will be the future world order, and how will it be defined by the role of cities? Over the next 3 days, we will discuss issues that have driven headlines in the past year and hone in on solutions for moving forward. We're going to look at the crisis of affordable housing, new mobility technologies, and how the concrete jungles some of our cities have become can be more livable and sustainable. We're going to look at the role of cities in migration and in delivering the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. We're going to examine the violence in cities and figure out how we're going to end that scourge that plagues all too many of us. We're going to look at the increasing political and economic divides within countries, both within cities and between cities and the regions that have been left behind by globalization. But we're also going to celebrate great new innovations and opportunities that are coming from cities, and particularly the aspiration of a new set of leaders who have been elected into offices of major cities around the world, including right here in Chicago. Our goal is twofold in the next few days: to discuss and highlight the key role cities play as actors on the global stage, not just as places where things are happening, and to serve as a platform for connecting all of you in fostering an exchange of ideas and develop workable solutions to common problems. So please meet new people, ask questions, challenge our assumptions, attend our private workshops tomorrow afternoon and go deeper with your fellow experts on issues of culture, data, migration, mobility, nature, urban violence, regional divides, and the SDGs. Engage on social media using the hashtag #GlobalCities2019. Fill out your comment cards to help us make sure that we do as well as we can this year and do even better next year. And most importantly, enjoy the next 3 days. But before we get started, there are a few people and institutions that I want to acknowledge. Without their support, none of us would be here, and none of what we're doing would be possible. The Financial Times has been our key partner from the beginning, and today has again published its special report on cities, and I hope you will read the report and continue to read this excellent newspaper. The Pritzker Family Foundation, whose extraordinary generosity in support of the forum we so gratefully acknowledge by naming our annual gathering the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities. The Robert R. McCormick Foundation, which so generously supports our year-round work on cities. Our lead sponsors, AbbVie and UL, who have been with us from the beginning. Our supporting sponsors, Grant Thornton, Kirkland and Ellis, and United Airlines, and our patron sponsors, Brinks, Hyatt Hotels Foundations, and Uber. All of you, thank you for what you continue to do. And I want to thank the mayors and the speakers who have come from afar and some from not so far to be part of the conversation and to contribute their expertise and insights. I want to thank our board leadership in elevating the role of global cities at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and in particular our Global Cities Advisory Committee, which has stimulated so much of what we try to do in these 3 days. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come across, if you came from the city, to come across to Fulton Market and be with us here today and for the next few days. Thank you all. Now, I'd like to share this message from our new mayor, Mayor Lori Lightfoot.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago. I want to first thank you all for visiting our incredible city. I also want to commend the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Financial Times for hosting this important forum. Now more than ever, cities have become the creative centers for developing public policy. We are driving the global conversation on issues from trade and transportation, childcare and climate change, immigration and economic equity, and much more. And Chicago is proud to be at the forefront of these conversations. We also know that great innovative work which addresses the needs of an urban population are happening all over the world. City governments, NGOs, and individuals are answering the clarion call to bring ideas and resources to respond to many challenges. In Chicago, we will work diligently to be a leader on these issues, but we can and we will learn from those innovators and be your partner in this important work. Our policies may be local, but our challenges are universal. I look forward to continuing to work together in the years ahead as we tackle our shared challenges and transform the lives of our residents at home and around the world. Thank you very much.
And now it is my great pleasure and honor to welcome Tom Pritzker, Chairman and CEO of the Pritzker Organization and Executive Chairman of Hyatt Hotels Corporation. Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, Ivo. Welcome to all of you. On behalf of the Pritzker Foundation, it's my honor to welcome everyone here tonight. I'm Executive Chairman of Hyatt, and I promised my wife that I wouldn't give Ivo trouble for hosting this at somewhere other than a Hyatt, so I'm not going to give you trouble for having hosted this somewhere other than a Hyatt. But I am going to check on your World of Hyatt points just to make sure what your status is. So Pritzker Foundation is proud to sponsor the Forum on Global Cities. Tonight we have three beyond me: my wife Margot, my cousin Brian Traubert. I call you my cousin, he's actually my cousin-in-law. And somewhere is Julie Weiland, who is 100% of the staff of the Pritzker Foundation. We're sponsoring this for a number of different reasons. First, cities are the economic engines of tomorrow. Getting cities right is the beginning of ensuring a more stable world for our children. That's a big deal, and it means that each of you have a chance to move the needle for our future. Second, getting it right is easier said than done. It means getting economic policy right. That includes budgets, capital investments, and systems of taxation. But it equally means getting social policy right. This includes education, crime, equal opportunity. All of that's a tall order. Finally, we've leaned into cities because we believe there's an increasing science that can be applied in getting cities right. And we want Chicago to be at the center of that space. We're committed to this gathering of visionary leaders who are both asking the right questions about the future of our cities, but also developing solutions to our global challenges. Every city has citizens who can afford to support their city through philanthropic work. Some see philanthropy as an obligation to pay society back for their good fortunes. We've tended to see philanthropy as an opportunity to move the needle for a community that we care about. In that context, in addition to supporting this conference on cities, I thought I might mention a few other examples where the Pritzker Foundation has supported cities in hopes of improving our communities and other communities that we care about. My purpose in mentioning these is to give you something to take home to discuss with leaders in your community. First, directly on point is our work at the University of Chicago. There we've been supporting initiatives to translate academic research into tools that can be deployed in order to improve city life. Working with the university, we established an effort called Urban Labs. Urban Labs uses science, data, and evidence-based programs to inform and develop urban policy for the biggest impact possible. To say it differently, Urban Labs employs data-based decisions around urban challenges. There are 5 labs organized around crime, education, health, poverty, and energy and environment. Each lab partners with the city to develop programs and policies in their respective areas. And we now have these same labs working with other cities to share the learnings. In addition to a number of education-related initiatives, we've given extensive support to Chicago's cultural institutions. We have a friend in China who's an urban planner, and from him I learned that cultural institutions are what gives a city its soul. In that connection, we were a founder of Millennium Park. I hope each of you during stay will visit Millennium Park, watch people's interaction with that environment, and you'll understand why we think this is critical to a healthy city environment. Finally, we've created the Pritzker Architectural Prize, the Nobel Prize in the field of architecture. Our purpose there is to support people's awareness of the importance of the built environment. With those 3 specific examples, I'd observe one other element of our philanthropy that I want to note. I mentioned that we see it as an opportunity to make a difference. Again and again, we have seen a pattern in our efforts. It's that the leaders of these Philanthropies are the secret sauce to making a difference. Because of that, our philanthropy looks not only for ideas, but we also seek to support great leaders. In that regard, the Chicago Council's Forum for Global Cities touches both criteria of a great idea and a great leader. We're passionate about the topic. We believe that Ivo has created a leadership team that's world-class in executing on that mission, and that's why I'm not giving him trouble for not having, never mind, I won't do that. I very much hope that you'll enjoy the next 3 days of conversations and dialogue, return again in the years to come, and thank you for the opportunity to welcome you all this evening. I look forward to this fascinating opening night program. Thank you very much.
Tom, Margot, Brian, Julie, and everyone else in the Pritzker Foundation, thank you again so much for your support and your philanthropy for the city as a whole, but also for the Chicago Council and for this particular forum, which now bears your name, and we're proud to have it. At this point, it's my great pleasure to once again introduce our co-conspirator, co-partner, co-host of tonight, Gillian Tett, who's chairman of the editorial board and editor-at-large, U.S. of the Financial Times.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ivo. I love being described as a co-conspirator. I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight because this event, which Ivo has very much created with his colleagues, is really one of the highlights of the FT's calendar in America. It's been getting better year by year, and I have no doubt that this year will be even better than before. And in many ways, it's incredibly timely to be having this conversation now. Because if you stop and think for a moment about what happened this week when the president went to London, in between meeting the Queen, in between walking around like he was on a set from Downton Abbey, in between dodging that blimp, the president took time before he arrived to unveil or to unleash a volley of Twitter attacks against Sadiq Khan, the mayor. And that's interesting because if you think back a few years, there was a time when presidents actually spent their time worrying about other national leaders and didn't bother to make the mayor of London their main piñata. And in some ways, that's a tremendous compliment to Sadiq Khan. It's quite useful for him politically, but it's also quite a compliment because it shows very graphically that mayors matter, cities matter. Today, it's not just about national politics, even or especially if you are in America. They matter economically. As the Financial Times, we care a lot about that. Every year we hear from Ivo just how important cities are in the global economy and how many people are in cities. They matter in terms of innovation. I mean, it really is true to say that today the hotbeds of innovation are found in cities, and the digital age has not changed that. Great irony of our digital cyber age is actually, in some ways, what we do physically in the world matters more than ever. But cities also matter enormously politically, and not just because for people like Donald Trump, they are a very convenient target for attacks against your perceived political opposition. In the last year or two, as populism and nationalism has swept across the Western world, and it's worth remembering that Bridgewater, the hedge fund, estimates that the proportion of the Western vote going to populist candidates today is about 40%. It's risen from about 10% at the start of the decade, and there's only been one other time in history where that's been seen before, and that's in the 1930s. But at a time when populism is sweeping the West, at a time when many national governments look, frankly, pretty incompetent at best, at a time when it's very hard to see exciting and inspiring examples of genuine experimentation and innovation, it's often the cities that are leading the charge. That's partly because they're often wealthier. It's partly because you have other innovation happening there. It's partly because, in many cases, the type of challenges you're facing in the world today are all about hopping across borders. Climate, refugees, internet, cybersecurity, those are international challenges which are not defined by borders. But I think it's also because cities are dealing with pragmatic challenges and they work together as units. They often try and come together and actually solve local problems in a practical way. And that's incredibly interesting. In many ways, cities are bastions of open, liberal values, problem-solving, innovation at a time we need that desperately. And since we at the FT are passionate about supporting and writing about liberal, open values, globalization, ways to build healthy communities and innovation, it's something we're fascinated by. So we have this great report. I hope you've all read it and memorized it, which is fascinating, actually. It tells a myriad of stories about what's happening in cities. We're going to be discussing it a lot in the coming days. And in the meantime, I'll just say thank you once again to Ivo. Thank you, Tom, for your generous support on the philanthropic side, and all the Pritzker family, looking at Margot. And we look forward to a great few days of conversation. And since we are journalists, we're always hungry for stories, tips, and ideas. So that's my plea. So thank you to all of you.
Our first conversation today explores cities and the world order. Please welcome Bathsheba Crocker, Vice President for Humanitarian Policy and Practice, CARE USA, and Ian Klaus, Senior Fellow, Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
So, you have a mid-century modern masterpiece, influenced by the likes of Le Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer, under the belief that a new urbanism could shape a new half-century. A nice garden to walk in, a museum-level art collection, and one of the loveliest bars in the whole world. Overlooking the East River, when it overflows, people spill out onto the veranda. It's no wonder NGOs and city networks seek to influence and seek entry into the United Nations. We have here on stage Sheba Crocker, as the description said, Vice President at CARE USA for Humanitarian Policy and Practice, and from 2014 to 2017, the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of International Organizations, which oversees all of the United States relations and management with the United Nations system. Yeah, I'm trying to make the United Nations sexy. It's after 6. You risk losing people when you say the UN. But the truth is, the multilateral system today that's under stress, in part because of reasons Jillian just laid out, in part because of ossification of institutions, is also under stress because new powers are seeking entry into it. Some of those new powers are states. Some of those new powers are cities and city networks. So I'm wondering, as Assistant Secretary, but also in your new role, how you've thought about sovereignty, international organizations, multilateral institutions, solving global problems in an urban era.
So thanks, and yeah, it is sometimes tough to make the UN seem sexy, but the bar is really good. So I mean, obviously, you could approach that question from a lot of different angles, and I think certainly from the perspective that I sat in until 2017, I was often struck that in so many ways, as you outlined, the UN system, which is a system, needless to say, that was built up at the end of World War II to deal with a certain set of understood challenges at that time, many of which it is still to this day dealing with, right? So you still have the UN Security Council as the preeminent body on, the maintenance of international peace and security, and built up around a system of nation states and on the basis of a certain understanding of sovereignty, was more and more being asked to deal with the crises of today. And we often say, and it's sort of a well understood maxim, that the UN is not fit for purpose. And that can mean a lot of different things, right? It can mean that the UN Security Council is anachronistic in its makeup, which is fair. And it can also mean that it's a system that was not set up to deal with the transnational challenges, with all of the transnational challenges that we face today. So, climate change is an example, terrorism is an example. And so what you've seen over the years is an attempt by the system to sort of figure out in different ways, and often on an ad hoc basis, how it's going to approach these issues. And normally what that means, because you have a system that has grown up on the basis of, certain countries having certain amounts of power in the system and not wanting to lose that power, and for other countries, particular organs of the UN in particular cities having resonance because they may have a lot of employees there or what have you, right? There's a lot of reluctance to change. And so what that often means is you sort of get new coordinating bodies, and you get new special envoys appointed for this or that, but fundamental change hasn't really happened. And I think when you layer on top of that the fact that there are, for example, cities of, in some cases, enormous size, right, who have a certain amount of clout and economic might and what have you to bring to the table, it's really hard to figure out how you adapt the system in ways that are going to make that kind of relationship workable, particularly, by the way, in an era, I think, where because of populism and some of the other trends that we're seeing from a geopolitical perspective, there's sort of a doubling down on this kind of pro-sovereignty sense that I think makes it even harder for those of us who sit in NGOs, for sure, but I imagine also for cities and other actors that are trying to sort of get a purchase in the system.
Well, as a brief aside, when I was negotiating at the UN, I often would get criticized by fellow diplomats for saying that I didn't have a poker face. I have a poker face enough to hide the fact that we don't have a clock running, and so I have no idea how much time we have left or to go. So if we could just have that start wherever it should be, that would be of great help to us. Some organizations that I think have admitted that they would benefit from better urban expertise include, the list could be very long, but the Department of Defense, the US Army, a number of regional development banks, including the Asian Development Bank. The list of organizations that seem to be about one thing, but in fact our urban focus is quite long as well. That could include Uber, Airbnb, and Lyft, global operations that essentially work almost exclusively in urban settings. There's one question about the role and the sort of ad hoc nature of adapting to challenges. There's another question about efficacy and knowledge. How do global organizations such as Care USA, but also such as the US State Department or multilateral organizations like the United Nations, operate simultaneously in mega cities and secondary and tertiary cities around the world? How do we sort of conceive of that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, it is a kind of a new, it's not new, but it's new-ish, right? In the sense that those of us who operate in this, the field that I operate in now, right, the humanitarian sector, we didn't grow up around the set of challenges that we have today. And we didn't grow up, we weren't conceived of, and nor was the UN system conceived of, to deal with the kind of crises and challenges that we face today in the settings that we face them. And so it seems to me that you can kind of approach this from two different levels. I mean, I'm sure multiple levels, but at least two, right? Because one is, it's just a question of how you function and can you be effective, right? So if you're an operational agency like CARE is, and you, and we grew up around responding to humanitarian crisis, by and large meant responding to natural disaster and mostly meant responding in rural settings. And now the vast majority of our response to humanitarian crisis is in protracted conflict and often responding in urban settings as opposed to in rural settings. And so again, it's this kind of idea, and particularly I think when you look at kind of a behemoth like the UN system, of adapting a sort of creaky, not fit for purpose system to a really new setting where it's really much more difficult to operate and understand how to operate. Right, and then you have the sort of the other layer of the role that cities might be able to play in terms of particular kinds of expertise that can be brought to bear. So to get to the point around kind of like the use of information and data, right? I mean, there's a whole set of institutions in the UN system that is meant to provide the kind of scientific and technical grounding and basis upon which so much of our daily life operates that we never even think about. It's become immensely more complicated, I think, when you think about, you know, how you deal then with the wealth of information that resides in particular cities when you deal with cities of sort of enormous size. And actors, again, on the international stage that rival some of the nation states that have a particular kind of seat at the table in the UN system. And it's funny when you think about a sort of a system that grew up around an agreement, right? There's kind of this pay-to-play aspect to the UN because all member states pay in a certain amount, right? And by virtue of that, you get a particular kind of seat at the table. And when you think about cities in the world or states in the United States or elsewhere that themselves have a bigger GDP than some of the biggest donors into the UN system, you know, you can conceive of a more fundamental shift around global governance, potentially. But I think you would have to think about things in a really different way because it seems to me, you know, sitting as a city and trying to sort of engage with this system probably feels hugely frustrating on numerous levels, but including because you're just never going to have the same kind of voice in the current setup, right, as a sovereign state does. And so maybe we really do, and I mean, I think there's an argument that we really, in some ways, do need to be thinking about a more fundamental reconception of the city, but it's of the system, but it's incredibly challenging and fraught, and usually too scary even to contemplate, right? Because you sort of fall back on the, well, you know, if we didn't have the UN, we'd have to create it, and we don't live in a world now in which we would be able to create the system. In
Let's do a little exercise there. Not inventing it anew. But as we're all familiar with, cities have become more active on the global stage in a certain world order. Global cities, one of the Pritzker Forums, you know, the title that we see there is in fact a product of a certain capitalist and largely often democratic international system with institutions that were built by the United States and allies soon after. Many people think that that order is under strain. That the long-standing alliances are fraying, that the institutions are archaic, and that norms are collapsing by the day. Cities have built networks and global advocacy in part based on the assumption that it would be a liberal system, that it was important to advocate at global institutions like the UN and to organize around global challenges like climate. Is there a scenario in which the sort of openness in which we've seen the rise of cities starts to close or looks dramatically different?
I mean, I think there's no question that there's a potential for that. You know, it also seems to me that there's a real potential for cities to play a kind of both advocating and diplomatic role in helping to maintain the openness of that system and the importance of that system, right? Because it's certainly under strain. And you know, you and I were talking in the taxi a bit on the way over about, you know, the challenges that the system is facing now because of the retreat of the United States in certain ways, because of the rise of populism, because of the doubling down on sovereignty that are making all kinds of questions from the maintenance of norms around humanitarian assistance to addressing, you know, problems like climate change and terrorism, to looking at human rights situations in countries, and the list goes on, right, making all of those things more challenging. And so I think there's an incredibly important sort of role that could be played to help fill in some of what is, you know, is sort of a growing vacuum in some ways that is really challenging to the system because, you know, and from where I sat before and from where I sit now, you know, you can see the difference that it makes when the United States is much more involved and more or less operating as a force for good in holding up that system, as creaky as it was. And when that is sort of pulled out in the way that it's being now, it's leaving an enormous vacuum, and it's leaving room for actors who want to close that space, right, to have much more running room than they traditionally have. And questions around space for civil society actors is closing, and I expect some similar threats are there for other kinds of voices, non-state actors as they're called in the UN system, to sort of play the same kinds of roles that we've come to expect.
It's interesting, the question about diplomacy and outreach to populations. I mean, we have just a second here, but Bill Burns writes in his new book, which is a tremendous overview of diplomacy over the last 30 years, that diplomacy is often secret and about building relationships in private, and it's tilling the garden, of course, as Kenan said, but it also is, if you're a city diplomat or if you're participating in the Pritzker Forum over the next few days, it's also about parties. City diplomacy is a very visible, very outwardly presentable practice that has as its sort of, as a fundamental premise, you have to make a political case for diplomatic engagement. And so I do think that there's a question about whether these institutions can somehow have more parties. I have a mission, it's a secret mission, Shiva doesn't know about it, which is to turn every senior US diplomat and national security official into an urbanist. And part of that is by seeing how many we can get to city-focused events and then having them inundated by other folks for the rest of the 2 days. And so I invite you to share with Shiva over the next couple days how you look at global challenges from an urban perspective, but right now to thank her for joining us tonight. Thank you. Here we go.
Concentrated poverty, war, refugees, rising sea levels, and pollution, all problems which are affecting cities the hardest. The magnification of challenges demonstrates the need for cities to find an actionable voice. Robert Mugga of the Igarape Institute will explore these challenges in a flash talk on mapping hotspots.
Any of you having trouble sleeping at night? I know I am. I think these folks may be part of the problem. Reactionary nationalists and populists, they've got a couple things in common. For one, they've got a stubborn immunity to science, especially science of climate change, on migration and security. They're also waging a full-scale assault on our cities, especially the underlying values of our cities, be it pluralism or cosmopolitanism or openness or tolerance. And maybe this isn't so surprising. After all, they're national politicians operating in the national interest. If I'm honest, it's these nation states that really are contributing to my insomnia right now. We all tend to forget that we're in a 400-year-old experiment of political engineering. And despite what people say about the return of the nation state, I actually think they're approaching their expiry date. Look, they're not going to go away anytime soon, but the reality is that they're unable and unwilling to deal with some of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. And part of the problem is that they're weakening. They're weakening from above because of hyper-globalization, the deregulation of capital, the flow of people and ideas, but they're also weakening from below because of the rise of social networks, of new technologies, of global philanthropy, of NGOs, of cities. And this couldn't happen at a worse time. You see, the world has changed, but the basic units of our international affairs have not. And I think we'd be better off looking at the world through the lens of cities. What you have here is over 2,000 cities with a population of 250,000 people or more. And to make it really simple, the bigger and redder the circle, the more fragile that city over the last 15 years, and the smaller and the bluer, the more resilient. If you look at this map, I want you to consider the following details. In 1648, when nation states first genuinely burst on the scene, less than 1% of the world lived in a city. Today, it's over half. By 2050, it'll be over 70%. That's 2.5 billion people moving to cities. That's baked in. That's not going to change. This is probably the most significant demographic shift in history. Tomorrow's hyper-urbanization isn't going to be evenly distributed. Most of it's going to be happening in this part of the world, in Africa and Asia. And this is going to generate enormous opportunities and challenges. On the opportunity side, we're going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of cities being built literally from scratch. They're going to be able to leapfrog old technologies, draw on distributed manufacturing, renewable energy, smarter mobility solutions, and the rest. And our big global cities, they're probably going to urbanize, they're going to densify, they're going to become more vertical and green. But the reality is the vast majority of the world's cities, thousands of them, are not going to be built with a future in mind. They're going to struggle to attract global capital, talent, and ideas. This is a really messy future that we're looking at. However, despite these challenges, I think cities are probably best placed to raise and to respond to some of our biggest challenges. Some cities are so economically powerful that they're rivaling nation states in power and influence. Just realized this is the wrong presentation. Let me go right here. They're going to in power and influence. Look at New York and New Jersey and the Newark region. This huge urban conurbation has a nominal GDP of about $1.7 trillion. That's larger than Russia or Canada or South Korea. Brussels is on par with Kuwait and Hungary. Chicago is the same size in terms of its nominal GDP as Taiwan or Belgium. Now, these cities are economically powerful, but they're punching below their weight politically. And this is dangerous. Cities need to be able to exert their urban sovereignty. This is because they're facing mega existential risks, and they're going to need all the political power they can muster to deal with them. I want to spend time talking about 9 of the big risks we're going to be facing over the next 3 days. I'm going to do that using this, Earth Time, which is a platform developed by Carnegie Mellon University and my institute and many others. So let me get right to it. Risk number 1, urban poverty and inequality. Although we've made incredible strides in dealing with global poverty around the world, it's still a major challenge in cities. Poverty is urbanizing precisely because the world is urbanizing, especially in Africa and Asia. But the scale of urban poverty is still pretty invisible because we're still relying on these kinds of data sets at the national scale. Concentrated poverty and inequality isn't just a problem, though, for the global south. It's a big challenge right here in North America and Western Europe. And it amplifies every other problem in cities, whether it's crime or access to affordable housing, or whether it's public services or economic development. It's also intergenerational. You know, children growing up in poor neighborhoods have permanently reduced life prospects. Let's take a look at Chicago. Chicago has an historically low unemployment rate right now of around 3.8 to 4%. But it hovers around 9% for African Americans. This is census data from 2012 to 2016 showing clusters of poverty by different groups. The reality is 1 in 3 African Americans living in Chicago are living in poverty. And this is due to a legacy of segregation, but also to deindustrialization. Let's go to crime, risk number 2. Crime is a problem for every city around the world. What you have here is national data on homicide rates, as well as data for the most violent cities around the planet over the last 20 years. Now, the good news is that crime's actually come down, violent crime, across North America and Western Europe by significant amounts in the last 2 decades. But there are still some hotspots, notably Latin America and Southern Africa. Right now, Latin America has 9% of the world's population and almost 40% of its homicides. It has 46 of the 50 most violent cities on the planet, including 17 in the country where I live in, Brazil. And this has a lot to do with concentrated poverty, inequality, and the other issues I mentioned. War, risk number 3. Armed conflicts are also widespread and becoming more internationalized. The red dots here represent individual fatalities or clusters of fatalities. There are about 50 armed conflicts ongoing right now. The big issue, though, is that armed conflicts are migrating to cities. And this is the #1 concern right now for many militaries, relief agencies, and development organizations around the world. Terrorism. Like crime and conflict, it's also unevenly distributed. Each of these clusters represents, again, groups of fatalities generated from incident reports. Now, they're both foreign and homegrown forms of terrorism, but we've seen a sharp increase since 2001, and especially since the Iraq intervention in 2003. But 2 big points. 90% of all terrorist fatalities in the last 5 years took place in less than 12 countries. including countries like Iraq and Syria, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Just 5% of all incidents took place in Europe. Less than 1% took place in the United States. That's not to say that we shouldn't be vigilant, but it's to put the issue into perspective. There is a real role for cities when it comes to de-radicalization and addressing extremism head on. Now with conflict, crime, and terrorism, you have refugees, lots of refugees. What you're going to see in a moment is each dot, which represents a single refugee. There are more than 25 million around the world right now. We haven't seen this level since the Second World War, and there's 36 million people who are internally displaced. And the big issue right now in the last 20 years is that they're moving to cities. The majority of refugees are moving to cities as opposed to being warehoused in camps or living in rural areas. But here's the punchline. 90% of them are staying close to home. Just 10% are making it to Western cities in the north. But even a small number can generate enormous ramifications. Rising temperatures is risk number 6. The last decade has been the hottest on record. And the burning of fossil fuels, as all of you know, is the chief culprit. What you see here is forest fires, industrial emissions and gas flares from satellites at night. And these warming temperatures are contributing to water shortages, to heat island effects, to biodiversity loss, as well as drought. It's also leading to massive levels of ambient air pollution. The World Health Organization estimated last year that about 7 million people died prematurely as a result of ambient air pollution. This is 10 times more the number of people who died as a result of violence of all causes. This is a chronic problem in cities Beijing or in Delhi, but it's also a big issue here, as all of you know, in North America. In California last year, there were 9,000 forest fires, consumed about 2 million acres of land. As a result, cities like Stockton, Sacramento, and San Francisco were the most polluted cities on the planet for a couple of weeks. Rising seas is risk number 7. The ice caps and sea levels, ice caps are melting and sea levels are rising because of this warming temperature. And cities are on the front line. Why? Because 2/3 of them are coastal. We're talking, according to the World Bank, of up to 140 million people being displaced as a result of rising sea levels by the middle of this century. What you see here is predicted land loss depending on changes in temperatures between 0 and 4 degrees. Shanghai, a megacity of 24 million people, goes underwater at 2 degrees Celsius. And this isn't just a problem for Asian cities or African cities or Pacific Island cities, and it is. It's a huge issue here in the States and all across the Americas, on the East and the West Coast. Here's San Francisco. San Francisco, the entire Bay Area, loses about 400 square kilometers at about 2 degrees Celsius, with about 500,000 people affected, and untold costs in terms of infrastructure. Risk number 8, pandemics. Climate change and globalization are generating new forms of public health hazards. What you see here is a spread of 2 viruses, not the most dangerous ones, but dengue and Zika over the last decade. Now, these viruses don't move linearly, they move exponentially. And the speed at which they're moving right now is accelerating, especially between our cities. The potential for catastrophic pandemic outbreaks is at the highest level the WHO has ever recorded. And cities have an enormously important role to play in addressing that. And it's not just public health types of risks, it's also digital viruses we need to worry about. And this is risk 9, my last risk. What you see here is Heartbleed. Some of you may remember Heartbleed first appeared in 2014. Actually, it started in 2012, but we only discovered it in 2014. It affected an estimated 70% of the internet. More than 600 million sites were affected by this one particular virus. So the rise of IoT, the move towards 5G, and the digitization of our cities, our smart cities, are a nightmare from a security perspective. Why? Because the internet, as all of you know, was not built with security in mind. And we're already seeing how viruses and hacking are affecting our cities. Just think of the Ukraine power grid in 2015, or think about the way in which our transport hubs are being hijacked in parts of the United States. So, I'm sorry for all the doom and gloom. I did tell you I was having trouble sleeping at night, but here's my punchline. Cities are key to solving and resolving and addressing some of these big global risks. And the good news is that they're already taking action around the world. But the problem is they can't deal with these challenges on their own. Cities are not islands. And while they may need to work with nation states, they can't rely on nation states to get the job done. So let me close with two big priorities, which will be discussed over the coming days. First, cities need to ramp up their soft power through diplomacy. If you think about it, cities are the originators of foreign policy. Just go back to Chinese or Greek or Roman city-states or the Hanseatic League in Northern Europe. Today, most global cities have some kind of diplomatic corps, engaging in economic or cultural or scientific or educational exchange. Cities are already influencing global agendas in a big way. Just think of the Paris Climate Agreement, where hundreds of cities push nation-states to take bolder targets. Or think of the compacts on migration and refugees, where cities played an active role. Or even on conventions to prohibit nuclear weapons, we have cities banding together, trying to push for stricter constraints. This is no longer an optional extra, this is an essential. My second point is that cities need to collaborate in international networks. You know, cities can leverage their urban sovereignty by working in international and national coalitions. They can pool resources, amplify their voices, and scale up standards around the world. Right now, there are more than 300 intercity networks, at least 100 of which are international or global in focus. There are more intercity networks than there are nation-state networks. Think of, on issues of global governance, we have the UCLG, Metropole, the U20, the Global Parliament of Mayors. On issues of climate, we have the C40, we have ICLE, and dozens of others. On security, we have APHIS, EFA, Strong Cities, UN Habitat, and more. Cities can bridge the local and the global. They are glocal, in the words of the late Ben Barber. They can be an antidote to this reactionary nationalism and populism that we're seeing. And at a time when our nations are in retreat, and our international and multilateral institutions are paralyzed, cities and mayors are stepping up. They're taking action and they're influencing. Look, mayors and cities are not going to solve all our problems, but if we can empower them just a little bit, maybe we'll all sleep a bit better at night. Thank you.
Tonight's featured panel, A Seat at the Table, will explore the interplay between cities and the international world order. Please welcome your moderator, Gillian Tett, U.S. Editor-at-Large, Financial Times. Former Mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel. Abba Joshi Ghani of the World Bank. Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees. Aramar Revi from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, and Fernando Medina, Mayor of Lisbon.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And we've just had both a chilling diagnosis of the challenges that are facing some of you, but also a rousing call to arms. And as the previous speaker said, in many ways, the solutions to these challenges lie in the hands of the mayors and the cities. So we have two current mayors and one former mayor with us right now to give us all the answers, to enable us to sleep well at night and reassure us. I'd like perhaps to start with you, Mayor Emanuel, and ask, you're no longer in the hot seat, so hopefully you can now speak incredibly...
After tonight, that is.
You can hopefully speak incredibly frankly and honestly about what you think.
Oh, that would be unusual for me.
Well, let it rip. Yeah. Let it rip. I mean, do you think it's reasonable to be looking to mayors today to provide leadership on these issues, which are fundamentally national and international in their nature?
Well, the short answer is yes and no. On the yes part, I mean, I do agree with the former speaker. It's kind of what my book's about, is that we're going to look back.
So you're writing a book, we should explain that to the audience.
Right, well, the folks from Chicago, at least, know that, is there's a receding of the nation state and the emergence of a city state. We are now more intimate, immediate, and impactful on our local situation and government. At least here, it's not different than Brussels, but Washington is Disneyland on the Potomac. It's not really handling issues. Ideas today move horizontally, not vertically. We'll share ideas of different things. Fernando and I were talking about housing issues, transportation issues. There are things that we're doing today. On the prior forum last year, we talked about family and parenting and counseling, and there's certain things we've done on early childhood to do also parenting counseling and guidance. So ideas move horizontally where they in the past used to move vertically. Now, you have a major event like a healthcare crisis that is more of a public health crisis. Cities are prepared but not capable on their own to handle that. Climate change, there's a void, and every one of us, the Mayor Fernando and I met in Paris at a conference there on climate change. We had a Chicago Climate Charter Conference. 86 cities have signed on to that individually customized plan to get to Paris 2025. So in one way, I would say we're doing it and doing more of it than ever before, but there are certain crises that happen that you cannot do it without a national government as a partner, but there is really an absent partner.
Right.
So I would say it's more yes than no, but there's a no part to it.
Right. Well, you're being unusually modest in not explaining to everyone that you have a book coming out at the end of the year or early next year on
Well, that
this
was a slow
very
pitch over
issue.
the center, so I decided to take it.
Yeah, well, so you have a book laying out these ideas coming out later this year or early next year. And I'm curious, today in America, where there is such visceral distrust in Washington, such frustration with the federal government, it's very easy to argue that cities are the main engine of activity and innovation. I'm curious about you, Martin, because you represent Bristol, which is that the third or fourth largest city in the UK?
It's one of the 10 core cities, one of the 10 biggest cities outside London.
Okay, one of the 10 biggest cities, one of the 10 cool cities. And yet, obviously, the UK does not really have a federal structure. It's much more clearly centralized. Would you agree that you are at the forefront of dealing with the challenges today in Bristol?
I say we should be. I mean, that question that you talked about, democratic legitimacy, I just rank that alongside climate change, migration, inequality, among a list of global challenges, or a list of challenges that cities all over the world are facing, that national governments working alone have shown themselves unable to deliver on. And it is one, I think, where city leadership is closer to people and can get things done like that. What I don't want to do is sit here and say this is the answer to all the world's ills. But there is another voice of governance that needs to be included in the systems of global governance that have not been systematically included so far. And that is the voice of city leaders. But I would add to that the leaders of networks of cities. So what I'm not talking about is just having Bristol at the table. It has to be Bristol speaking in cooperation with Chicago, with Lisbon, with Paris, with Freetown, and coming with beginning to develop a shared global urban voice.
Right. I mean, Mayor Fernando, Mayor Medina, you've been already liaising with some of the other mayors. I was just hearing backstage about how you've been talking about climate change and looking for shared solutions. How much of your focus today is just on Lisbon, and how much are you looking out to connect with other mayors?
Well, we connect a lot, and because we need it. Basically, we are facing the same challenges. We have naturally different situations on departure, different frameworks to act, and the dimension of each challenge is different, but basically we are facing the same. Climate change is happening now, and is happening, and it will affect people, humans. Climate change is not a problem of the planet. The planet was here much before. It has seen a lot of changes on temperature, on a millennial basis. The question is about human life and our ability to live well. So all of us are dealing with the same problems. How can we tackle reducing emissions, putting a carbon neutral cities? How can we capture emissions? So everyone is dealing more or less with the same problems, with different realities. So we learn a lot. Like Ram said, the information now is more horizontal in the sense I want to know what he's doing. I want to know what Paris is doing, what London is doing. We just copy ideas, and that's very good.
Right. I'm curious. I mean, I'm going to turn to Alban and Roma in a moment, but given that you all three are deeply engaged in the issue on climate change, which of course is particularly interesting in America given that the federal government has taken a different stance, do you think it was a mistake that the Paris Accord was essentially driven by agreements between nation states? Should they have had cities, municipalities, smaller regions involved in the Paris Accord?
Well, you know, let me say one thing. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion on climate change. And yes, the short answer to your question is yes. Because when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, cities, whether it's in office buildings, big housing, cars, is a big contributor, but also has the bigger play in solving that problem. Our issues, while we deal with climate change, I don't want to speak for the other mayors, I would guarantee you a bigger bulk of our time is on housing, education, transportation, and quality of life issues, of which climate change has an impact on it. I think, and I would not want to say this so it's misinterpreted, that is one of a series of issues that we talk about, but I would say you could have a whole day conference just on the issue of housing and what's happening in our economies and the impact on families, transportation and making neighborhoods and cities viable, and that, as a former mayor, that consumed not an inordinate, a bulk of the time where climate change was a key issue. Look, when I became mayor, Chicago had 2 coal plants operating. We were the last big city in America with 2 coal plants, and we had a major public health issue in and around Pilsen and Little Village. But the big major issue is housing, transportation, education, quality of life, affordability of living in a city that is now getting priced out of existence for working families.
Yeah.
Right.
And I would say it's the conversation we have in the city that we have to deliver on, you know, many, many fronts at the same time, not just a single issue. On that point you make there about climate change, one of the points I've made is that actually we need to give people the economic space, the emotional space to think about existential threats that are 10, 15, 20 years away. If they're worried about where they're going to sleep tonight, where their children are going to sleep, and if they're going to feed their children tomorrow, then we don't create space for an environmental movement that's inclusive of everyone, including the poorest people. It just becomes a middle-class pursuit that's pursued and imposed on our populations. But that's where cities become important, because they are working on all those fronts at the same time and creating the conditions for success to be more rather than less likely.
Right. But, I mean, from the perspective of the World Bank, again, the World Bank has traditionally dealt with nation states. You are doing more micro-level work now, but do you think that the policy direction needs to tilt towards dealing more directly with cities and trying to create networks of cities in the way that the mayors are talking about?
No, thank you. Thank you for that question. Because I think that, you know, institutions like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, if you take these multilateral organizations, they were created at a time when the idea was to deal just with nation states. So cities were not a part of that equation or paradigm. But let me say that that has not restricted us from dealing with cities. So we may go through the national government, but especially in the urban space, we are dealing directly with cities. And given that there are some 70,000 odd cities in this world, increasingly we are dealing with a set of cities or looking at regional programs. And, in addition to lending, I think our key aspect of our support to cities is really in capacity building, be it governance and institutional strengthening and regulations. So, I think it's very, very important to bring that side of cities up, because at the end of the day, if cities are to lead, then they should be able to raise finances and meet their own agenda in terms of investments and not be totally dependent on national funds coming down to them. But I wanted to just step back a little and say that, we heard from both the mayors here that cities are not just dealing with climate change or migration, so we know today that urban space is really a space where all development challenges meet, be it migration, climate change, social, housing, inequality, exclusion, crime. But cities are also spaces which can actually give solutions to these. So if, I'm not going to go into the numbers, but you have, the 80% of GHG emissions, but also 80% of GDP contribution from cities all over the world. So, and I also want to put it to everybody that it's not a homogeneous ecosystem. So you can talk about cities like Chicago and Bristol and London and Lisbon and so on, and having a voice at the table. We're also talking about cities which do not even have a voice at the national level. Even in large democracies, cities come way down, even though cities are where the government actually meets the citizens and where actual solutions happen. And they are talking the talk and walking the walk, and the action is there. So
absolutely, yeah. Well, that picks up on Emmanuel's point about the immediacy of cities and the fact you actually had this intimate connection between voters and citizens and the organs of government. But I'm curious how this works in India, because India is a place of incredible growth, urbanization. In many ways, you epitomize the trend towards urbanization. You're dealing with a very messy federal structure where federal political processes often don't work. Do you see more reason to be optimistic about the cities in India than the federal national level?
Of course, India can't transform unless our urbanization transforms the country. But remember, we are a 2/3 rural and a 1/3 urban country. So India's transformation is fundamentally a cultural transformation. And to pick up on what the mayor said just now, that is a big change. So in some senses, whether it's climate change or it's dealing with the question of employment, cities are the places where we're actually going to find that shift taking place. Like we did in Europe a century ago, we've seen in the Americas over the last 100 years or so. The question is, how does one do that in a 21st century frame? In which, like Mayor Emmanuel was saying, the role of the nation state is actually shifting. And I think part of this requires a new imagination. Cities were there before the first nation states were created, before the first firms were created in some senses. So we have a long history in our parts of the world to actually draw upon, to look at where these shifts can actually take place, both in the politics and the economics, and in the cultural imagination.
I couldn't agree more. I happen to do my PhD in Central Asia, and if anyone who's studied Central Asian history, which is a very small minority of people, but in this room anyway, will know that Central Asian history is a story of city-states, and that was the unit of government. And I often think we're going back to the future. I also think that one of the worst things that was ever done was calling the United Nations, not the United Entities. But I'm curious though, because one of the interesting things that came out when I was writing the column for the supplement about the growing role of cities, the ambition of cities, came from an interview I had with the mayor of Milan, who pointed out to me that there's a common thread in Europe, which I'm sure that you'll feel in Lisbon as well, that cities are becoming the bastion of liberal values, if you like. And that's partly because cities are the winners of globalization, often, not always, but the winners tend to be found in cities. And in a place like Italy, the mayor of Milan would argue that actually there's a real split between the liberal, more left-wing or centrist politics of cities and the hinterland. Do any of you have any thoughts? I'm sure it's the same in Portugal too, and in some ways it's the same in the UK with Brexit. Do any of you have any thoughts about how to bridge that great divide? And is that going to get bigger in the coming years? Well, basically the rural-urban is actually adding to the sense of polarization.
Well, I don't want, if anybody else will.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily agree with you there. What we just saw before we came on was the dark side of cities. Yeah. And for all of history, cities have actually concentrated risk and poverty and unemployment. So the interesting thing for us is, and that's why mayors and city leaders are so important, is actually turning things around, because they are places of tremendous opportunity. But you have to balance the dark side with the opportunity. I think that is the question, that's a political moment, that's a question of structure, that's a question of imagination and getting the systems right.
Well, first of all, if you look at any election, at least in the States, but if you also look at the Brexit outcome, there is a different economics between urban and rural. If you were thinking from a national political standpoint, you would not let that dichotomy hold. And if you actually look at where, let's just take the recent election, Democrats were successful, they actually outperformed in rural areas, not just did well in urban. And I think one of the things that I think people are yearning for right now is somebody that can find common foundations and areas. I think there's a set of issues on transportation, education, health access, and healthcare that you can actually find a commonality that would actually not allow that bridge. The bridge can be there. A successful national politician or elected official and party is one that finds enough to find common foundation in that area. So I don't accept, now, there is a reaction in the rural areas because they feel forgotten and not heard.
Yeah.
One of the things a successful elected official does is make sure that people's voices are heard and they feel counted in that debate. That can also happen, I want to say this, in an urban setting as well. It's not just restricted to urban versus rural. That is when you're thinking of it from a national level.
I mean, Martin, you are in a particularly interesting situation because you have stood up very proudly and said, I champion immigration, refugees, an open city, even though at the moment one's dealing with Brexit. And I think you came out and said that you wanted to essentially, have an open for business international perspective to Bristol, even amid Brexit. Do you feel that tension?
I don't feel so first of all, I think part of that kind of rural-urban split comes because people create a framework for people to approach the world through that kind of zero-sum conflict. Right. Cities are not making rural areas poorer. It's the way the global economy has been put in. So in fact, that's not the fault of cities. And in my city, Bristol is a very wealthy place. We got a fantastic story to tell to the world about tech and aerospace, and a third of the world's natural history broadcasting comes through the city. We've got 25% of my kids in poverty. Seventh worst city in the UK to be born black in. One of the worst cities to be born poor in. So we hold these inequalities within city, a very different experience of city life as well. So you've got to take both sides of it. It's just not that simple. In fact, CNN did a piece the other day, and they butchered it, to be honest. Because I started...
Tell us how you really feel.
Well...
if in doubt, blame the journalist. I think that's another thing.
No, we can all agree on that.
Yeah, exactly. You can all agree that I'm going to be target
Please don't be a wounded journalist. But honestly, I started off by talking about the top side of Bristol, but I always say Bristol's got this great story to tell, but tens of thousands of people are not the start of it. They then did a piece on Brexit with me saying all the wonderful things about Bristol, and then they cut it there and they went to all the poverty in the rural area. That was a really poor piece of journalism, and it set a framework for people thinking that that is the way the world is understood. Some of the other divides as well. I mean, I am supportive of migration. I am the result of migration. My dad was a 12-year-old, came from Jamaica. My mum, white. My grandfather came from South Wales and Ireland before that. I am the product of it, so I don't think it's an issue. And dynamic identities that are multidimensional are not a problem if people are equipped with the skills and a sense of self to be able to live with that. Unfortunately, with the Twitterization of our civic discourse, everything's becoming of one dimension and people can't cope with difference and change, and that's an issue. If I can just say one thing I think fundamentally about cities only exist because stuff moves and crosses over. If stuff doesn't move, cities begin to die. Our challenge as a city is not to stop stuff moving like national governments want to do. Our challenge as cities is to say, how can we best position ourselves with the skills and resources to be able to take advantage of movement rather than just trying to stop it?
Right. Abba, and then I'd like to bring Mary.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, mostly in keeping with what Marvin just said, is that the urban-rural dichotomy is a false dichotomy. We cannot look at cities as islands. They do connect back to the agricultural towns, and that's how things move, and that's how value chains and supply chains are formed. And I think what is interesting is that national governments have taken advantage of creating this rural-urban divide. And I think that's where cities have to rise up. And also, I think it's really important that, there's this whole migration of people from rural to urban areas or to cities. And that's it's not a push factor unless it's in a conflict or a zone or somewhere where there are floods and droughts or climate change. But it's a pull factor of people looking for those ladders of opportunities. You know, it is well known now that there is no future in rural poverty, that every path to prosperity goes through cities. So how do national governments today empower those cities? And although, you know, cities have a voice at the table mostly through networks, I also wanted to raise it to the three mayors. There is a plethora of networks. Right. So how do you actually say, if we want a dominant hard voice at this table, which network is going to
Well, I'd love to ask that to Mayor Fernando. Which networks do you take part in internationally to learn about what's happening in other cities? And do you feel that they are effective at actually coordinating a voice?
Let me just go a little back to the previous question, because in fact it is true that global cities are raising their importance and they are very connected. In the sense, a young people from a Portuguese university is connected with some guy that is in New York University or in Chicago or in Seattle, LA, and definitely he has traveled to Madrid, Barcelona, Milan or Shanghai, because they do that. And young people, much different from my generation, and I'm 45, they don't want to buy cars, they don't want to buy houses, they don't want to be strings attached, and they are very moving, and they are always connected. So universities are connected, research centers are connected, multinational corporations are connecting, tourism is connecting people. So this type of movement still exists. In fact, and this is the bone of the growth of global cities. But at the same time, is inside the cities, those same cities that we face much more severe exclusion problems that you face in rural areas. Because the question is that, the difficulty is that as we are more successful or putting our cities in the global area and being more competitive and more able to allow jobs well paid, the gap between those guys with opportunities and no opportunities inside our cities is going to enlarge. And the question is that we have all the reality in the same city. For instance, Lisbon, in the strictest sense, is a small city in area, 100 square kilometers. We have global companies. I'm here talking to you, here in Chicago. I have neighborhoods where I have to deal with early school leavers at the age of 16, and they have risks of dropping out schools. It's 100 square kilometers. So the idea that there is a conflict between cities and rural areas, that's not a big split.
Right.
That it is not a big split. The split it's even inside cities more difficult to solve. Very soon, I think the most dynamic networks now deal with climate change. I think they have, because in climate change, in climate action, you take care of everything. You take care of transports, housing, energy production, social inclusion, because social inclusion is critical. Climate change does not affect people in the same way. So I think the most dynamic networks are, in our days, connecting in all around.
That's interesting. I think that's my impression as well, but would you agree?
Well, climate change is received appropriately the amount of energy from an international standpoint. Our systems are different, but if you got mayors together in the States, they would be immediately talking about education or transportation. And so it depends on what type of forum and what type of topic. You get the mayors of the 50 biggest cities in the United States, it's going to be centered on education and transportation, and then probably housing and quality of life issues. And how you fund education, and that's why, getting back to your question about the dichotomy of the split, it's a framework to understand stuff. But I will tell you this, a parent in rural America, and I just coming from a bike trip, has the same aspirations, same hopes, same fears, same sense of urgency for their kids as a parent in a city. And if you talk about the aspirations for your children, it doesn't have a geographic split.
Absolutely.
And so I think it is more of a way of understanding the world But if you break down those kind of paradigm, you'll actually see the aspirations and hopes are no different. And finding a language that brings people together and finding a common aspiration is the best way you're going to find actually solutions to political problems.
Well, let's hope so. We have time for a couple of questions, and I'm conscious that in the audience there are a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge about these issues. So if anyone would like to ask a question, we have 2 microphones in the aisles, one there and one over there. And we are using the microphones this year, not passing around microphones. So if anyone would like to ask a question or raise a point. Everyone needs some alcohol or some wine to start with. Question there, and I think do we have a way to get the mic, because it's quite hard for them to get out. Okay, thank you.
Hello, Arturo Cervantes from Mexico, and thank you for the opportunity to make a question. More and more cities throughout Central South America and developing countries are experiencing extreme forces derived from international providers, for example, guns. You have in Latin America 50 of the most dangerous countries, 50 of the most dangerous cities throughout the world are in Central America. Why are they so dangerous? And if we look at other cities in North America and in European, more developed economies, which have the companies which are producing the goods, which are producing the chaos and the deaths and the violence, how is this international relation to play forward in Agenda 2030? If you really are interested in city growth,
right.
These issues on international commerce should be part of the equation.
Right. Mayor Emanuel.
I think, you know, there was some recent articles here nationally about the amount of what's happening in Brazil, what's happening in Mexico, and also in Central America. And you have 2 major forces, which are guns and drugs, or narcotics. Not the sole forces, but those are a big element in the forces. And the international narcotics effort, and this is an example where we can talk about the importance of a city, but without a national government and international cooperation, you're not going to solve these problems. They're too big for one municipality to handle on their own in that effort.
I think that's an example of why we need cities to have that influence. I'm thinking from my Bristol, we begin to talk about devolution in the UK now. We're the most centralised country in Europe, and you devolve power to cities to have more control over what goes on inside their boundaries. You know, that's what it says on the tin anyway. It doesn't always work like that. But what cities also need is the power to shape the context within which they have to operate, because that context impacts on what goes on in cities. You can't roll down responsibility within your own little bubble when you've got all these forces coming from outside you and you've had no opportunity to speak into them and shape global policy. So we had this discussion just this afternoon about how do you move global governance into its next iteration, where leaders of cities and networks of cities are equal partners to national leaders in shaping national and international policy.
Well, I can see lots of hands waving now. We've got a question there, and then back there. And I'll ask you actually, because we have only got a few minutes left, to be brief in the question.
Ron Nazer from DePaul University in Chicago. As you described the rural-urban difference and the rise of populism, is it different from, what is the role of culture and history, or does it all just plain come down to economics?
Wow.
Well, I think if you look at our last election in 2016, it would be a mistake to think it only through the prism of economics. First of all, because Fernando and I were talking about this a little earlier, you are experiencing a middle-class revolt, while a lot of the discussion appropriately on a policy level is about income inequality. A middle-class revolt had to do with a certain sense of disrespect that was happening to them, their children, and their aspirations, and to think that you can only see this through the prism of economics, short of culture, is to misunderstand the sense of grievance that has been built up, at least in the United States over the last 20 years, where the middle class feel that the elite have one rule book that applies to them, and another rule book that applies to them and the middle class and their children that's totally different. And I think there's a big cultural element to this to understand populism. And if you only looked at it from economics, you'd be missing a big piece of the conversation.
Yeah. I think, yeah. I would imagine you'd say the same thing in Europe, would you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the rise of populism, if I look in the UK, if I can just chuck this one among many other, is the struggle of white identity. People don't know, white English people don't know what their identity is. And some other groups, like the Welsh, Irish, Scots, they've had to fight for their identity, migrant groups, and I think that in the face of that, as society begins to change, they say, who am I? What's my story? What am I a part of? And some people are picking up on that sense of lostness, as well as their sense of alienation from globalization.
We've actually got a question right at the back there. I think we should waiting patiently first, and then
Gloria Castillo from Chicago United. We've been presented with two facts. One is the rise of nationalism, and the second is the increase of refugees moving around the world. Are cities prepared with infrastructure to deal with the movement of refugees into your cities, and how are you looking at housing, healthcare, care of children that are moving across borders? We're seeing, I think, a real humanitarian crisis in the United States at our border, and certainly there may be other implications that we're not aware of on a global basis.
Right.
Are cities prepared?
Great question. I think since we are so short of time, I might take your question as well and see whether there's any overlap, or we can wrap them together for last comment.
No overlap on that one.
No overlap. Okay. Well, in that case, we may have to skip.
Can I take that one? I think nationalism is a self-defeated approach when you take 2 or 3 nationalists. Let's talk about Europe. Do you know what are the worst adversaries of the nationalists of Italy? It's the nationalists of Austria, because Italy says, I cannot take refugees, we have to share the burden for everyone, and Austria said, not in my country. Do you know what are the worst enemies of the Austrian nationalists? It's the Polish nationalists, because Austria says we need to get out and stay a little bit restrained against US and against European Union. We need to talk to Putin. Then go to a Polish elite and say, Russia is our friend, not going to work. So nationalism is an ideology. That's another example. A lot of nationalism in Europe is about not putting more money or more power in the European Union. That's good for a nationalist in the north, in Milan, for instance. But a nationalist of 5 stars, the populist movement in the south, it's impossible, because they said, no more money for me, I need more money in the south of Italy. So at the end of the day, that discourse and that approach is mining confidence, but is self-defeating, because really in Europe, we have more the ability and more the means to solve the refugee crisis, because Europe is declining on population. We have a problem with population. We have a problem with the workforce, and the numbers that we are dealing in Europe are ridiculous. If you talk about 3 million people or 6 million people, for instance, you are talking about 2%, less than 2% of all the population. Let me just finish to give an example. My country, Portugal, a very small country in this context, we had 7 million people in 1974. We were the last European country to decolonize in Africa. And in 2 years, arrived to Portugal 700,000 people, 10% of all the population. What happened? Everyone was integrated. We have problems, yes, we had problems. We built houses, we built sanitary, we built water, everyone that was there. The problem of refugees is more the question of ideology, a question of lack of empathy, lack of ability of having a common approach, because in Portugal we need people. We have capacity of having refugees, but they don't arrive to Portugal. They are being closed in Italy or in other places before.
When Puerto Rico had their major weather event, Chicago took in 10,000 people from Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. Housing, schools, healthcare, all went fine. We could meet that again at a certain level.
Well, Well, I can see lots of hands are starting to raise. I see that everyone's trying to jump in at this point, and that is exactly the right spirit, because it shows the conversation so far has started to really ignite passions. It's actually very nice to end on a positive note, because we are pretty much out of time, and to actually look at tangible examples where progress has been made, because what's become clear in the last couple of hours is, one, we are at a very interesting tipping point, or an interesting moment of change, as Mayor Emmanuel said, in terms of the role of cities. The challenges are clearly huge. We had that very chilling set of nine challenges and very ominous looking dots on the graph. And yet there's clearly a spirit of cooperation and mutual learning and problem solving. So thank you all very much indeed for sharing your experiences. Best of luck to all of you for finding answers to these problems in the next couple of days for all of our benefits. And I will just say thank you and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm very sorry.
This concludes our opening night program. Please exit to your right to enjoy tonight's reception.